Eligibility explained. This training will review the process for initial evaluation, reevaluation, differentiate initial evaluation and reevaluation processes, identify evaluation timelines, and reference documents on PI. When it comes to eligibility, the quality and content matter. The timelines matter. It is complex and nuanced. When comparing initial and reevaluation, the process is complex. Some things are the same. Evaluation and eligibility criteria are the same for initial evaluation and reevaluation eligibility determination. Some things are different. Procedures are different for initial evaluation and reevaluation eligibility determination. Timelines are different for initial evaluation and reevaluation eligibility determination. One of the similarities is that eligibility determination requires multiple measures to be considered for both initial and reevaluation procedures. These measures need to include formal and informal measures. During the reevaluation process, the team will include evaluations conducted during previous evaluations and data sources gathered during instructional periods leading up to the reevaluation. Additional similarities include the necessary documentation for eligibility criteria. Each eligibility category has different requirements. There are 13 eligibility categories total. The special education rules are the best way to know what the requirements are. Those rules can be accessed through the USOE website. The My Idea eligibility forms are built to prompt the correct information, but the special education rules define the specific criteria fully. The following slides will discuss the initial evaluation and eligibility determination process. The forms you need for an initial evaluation include the referral, consent, notice of meeting, eligibility determination, and meeting summary form. The initial evaluation and eligibility determination procedure begins when the LEA designee signs the referral form and assigns a case manager. Then, the multidisciplinary team, or MDT, discusses the areas of evaluation to be included in the consent form. The MDT is made up of the special education team, including the special educator, school psychologist, speech and language pathologist, and other specialists involved in determining which areas of need for the student need to be evaluated. After the team determines which areas to obtain consent form, the case manager completes the consent form and sends it to the parent or guardian with a copy of the procedural safeguards. The case manager calls the parent to explain that the consent form is coming home. They can suggest to the parent that they call you, the case manager, or the LEA designee/principal with any questions or concerns. Tell the parent that they need to return the form to you before the evaluation can begin. When the consent form is returned, the case manager dates the consent form showing the date of return. The multidisciplinary team begins the evaluation if parental consent is given. The eligibility determination is based on multiple measures from a variety of sources. That is why the multidisciplinary team is involved. The multidisciplinary team meets to review the evaluation findings and discuss the proposed area or areas of primary disabling condition. The multidisciplinary team then completes the evaluation and drafts the evaluation summary and proposed evaluation and eligibility determination document, and schedules an IEP team meeting. The case manager or paperwork assistant, if appropriate, sends home a printed notice of meeting form to the parent at least 5 working days before the IEP team meeting. It is very important to keep in mind that the team is proposing an area of disability and proposing a student's eligibility and not making determinations without meaningful parental participation. This is a proposal and no decision is made without parental input. The team can have informal meetings without the parent, but the parent has an important role in the IEP process and is always an important team member. The IEP team convenes to determine the eligibility. The eligibility form is completed when the student is eligible and when the student is not eligible. Eligibility determination must be completed within 45 school days of the date of receipt of parental consent. If the consent form is not dated when it is returned to the school, the date the parent signed the form is used to measure the 45 school day timeline. Here are some additional considerations for the IEP team. Decisions regarding the use of specific evaluation tools are made by the professionals involved in the evaluation. School teams may have discussions concerning possible eligibility. However, to avoid predetermination, final eligibility decisions must be made by the entire IEP team, including the parents or guardians. The student must meet the 3 prongs of eligibility. The student must meet the eligibility criteria for the specific disability category. The disability must have an adverse impact on his or her educational and/or social performance, and he or she must require specialized instruction to access the general curriculum. Having a discrepancy, medical diagnosis, or other test results may only fulfill prong number 1. The team, including parents, must also determine that the student meets prongs 2 and 3. Opportunities for meaningful parental participation in the evaluation process must be documented. This can be accomplished by one or more of the following: reporting results of parent surveys, questionnaires, and rating scales, record of phone calls and other conversation, specific documentation of information provided by the parent from outside sources and how this information was considered by the school team members, and specific documentation on the meeting summary of questions or concerns brought up by the parent in the meeting. The next section will focus on the reevaluation process. The forms required for the reevaluation process are the notice of meeting, the reevaluation data review, the consent form if applicable, the notice of meeting form if applicable, the evaluation and eligibility determination, and the meeting summary. Unlike the initial eligibility determination, the reevaluation eligibility process has different due dates. The reevaluation data review has to happen before every eligibility determination after the initial eligibility determination. Davis School District recommends doing the RDR at the IEP meeting before eligibility comes due. The reason for this is it saves on IEP team meetings and it helps your team plan ahead. If the IEP team is changing eligibility in between the 3-year timeline, the RDR still needs to take place. The RDR is done every time the eligibility process is held, not just every 3 years. The eligibility must be done at least every 3 years. The eligibility can be done sooner than every 3 years, but it must be done at least every 3 years. The eligibility timelines matter. Eligibility needs to be determined every 3 years. The IEP team needs to plan ahead and complete eligibility early. It is not allowable to go beyond the 3-year timeline. The order the forms are completed in is important. The reevaluation data review must be completed first. This is how the team determines which areas, if any, of evaluation are completed. Then consent is obtained, and then the evaluation is completed and eligibility is conducted. The eligibility must be done within about a year of the reevaluation data review process. The reevaluation data review opens the door of the eligibility process, and the eligibility process is closed out by completing the eligibility determination paperwork. Eligibility determination needs to be based on current data and include all of the evaluation and eligibility criteria defined by the USOE and the IDEA. The documentation also needs to include current information for all areas of need as identified by the IEP. Current means data gathered within 90 days of the eligibility meeting date. The reevaluation process is to identify student needs and determine eligibility. Even though it is obvious students with more severe disabilities are eligible for services, they might continue to require updated formal assessments to ensure their needs are identified and met. The following slides will discuss the reevaluation and eligibility determination procedures. First, up to 1 year before the student's eligibility is due, IEP service providers gather current data about the student's performance before convening the RDR meeting. Current data is the information from the past semester or past 90 school days. Data can be based on instructional data or other informal assessment. Then the IEP service providers update the reevaluation data review form on MyIdea. When the team is updating the RDR form on MyIdea, they have two options. They can indicate that the existing data are sufficient to determine eligibility and the nature and extent of special education services and related services, or they can indicate that the existing data are not sufficient to determine the eligibility and nature and extent of special education and related services needed. When the team determines additional assessment is needed, the areas to be assessed are marked. Any areas marked need to be assessed. The areas assessed can be measured using formal or informal assessments, but assessment must be conducted. Note that hearing and vision measures are those measures that are other than the screening assessments conducted on a regular basis at the school location. If the team marks an area to be assessed and then later determines that area does not require assessment, there are specific procedures to addend this section of the reevaluation data review form. Please refer to the PI document regarding the reevaluation procedure for those specific procedures. After the IEP team has drafted the RDR form, the team meets to review the RDR data and determine the need for further assessment. This could be done at the IEP before the eligibility is due, via a conference call with the whole team, or as a separate meeting. The team determines if the additional assessment is needed. If additional assessment is selected, the team selects the areas of assessment and when the assessment will begin. If additional assessment is needed, the team obtains consent. Consent is valid for 180 calendar days. That's about 6 months. If applicable, the MDT begins and completes the assessment. The case manager schedules the eligibility meeting before the eligibility due date, and a notice of meeting is sent home. The IEP team convenes to determine eligibility. The eligibility form is completed when the student is eligible and when the student is not eligible. To review the reevaluation eligibility determination process, the RDR opens the door Sometimes consent for evaluation is obtained, and then eligibility is always done at least every 3 years. Eligibility closes the reevaluation process. Here are some final wrap-up comments. Each form includes a prior written notice statement. Prior written notice is a requirement under the IDEA. It informs the parent of their student's rights and their own rights under the IDEA. The prior written notice also communicates the purpose of each document and procedure. Finally, the prior written notice communicates what the parent's signature on the form means. And finally, a few key reminders. Anything marked as an area of evaluation on the reevaluation data review form needs to be evaluated. Formal and informal evaluation are allowed. Consent for evaluation is valid for 180 calendar days. And the eligibility form is completed when a student is eligible and when a student is not eligible. Keep in mind, planning ahead with the RDR and initial evaluation process can decrease stress and frustration for your entire team. And now you should be able to support your mentee by reviewing the process for initial evaluation and reevaluation, differentiating initial evaluation and reevaluation procedures, and identifying evaluation timelines and referencing the documents on the PIE site. Please contact your supervisor or coordinator anytime you have a question about reevaluation and refer to the PIE site.